Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to talk about public transport, why it works, what stops it from working, and what policy levers governments should be pulling to ease the path towards greater investment and better outcomes. And in particular, we're going to talk about the role of the nation's rail network in transforming the entire public transport system, why rail reform is important, and perhaps what it might look like in theory and in practice. But of course, rail is just one piece of a huge and complex jigsaw that makes up public transport puzzle, one that involves a range of different and evolving modes, from buses to trams to bikes to taxis and minibuses, and increasingly now micro-mobility such as e-bikes and e-scooters. And it's a puzzle that's challenged the UK government, well, it's challenged many governments around the world for decades, and delivered regular policy papers and initiatives, each designed to transform our lives. The question, of course, is whether any of these are ever worth the paper they're printed on. Is an efficient, effective and affordable public transport system ever a realistic proposition for the UK? So to discuss this knotty issue, it's my pleasure to welcome Colette Carroll, Managing Director for Transportation at consultant Atkins Realis, to the podcast today. Colette's brief oversees the firm's work in railways, highways and local transport markets, and having spent much of her early career working in government driving transport and rail policy, Colette should know more than most about public transport challenges. So Colette, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks ever so much, Anthony. Delighted to be here.
Well, Colette, as I pointed out, you have several decades on the front line creating and setting the policy agenda for a decent public transport system. So how would you describe the state of the UK's current public transport system? You know, as a system, of course, is largely underpinned, of course, by the rail network.
So I think, Anthony, where I would start is just with one word, and that's challenging. But actually, I would move on from challenging with there is so much nascent opportunity. And for me, it's part of the conundrum of transportation and why I've spent so much of my career in it, which is this incredible social and economic good that is transportation, that are the arteries that join together our nation, whether that comes to economic activity, education, leisure. And yet, you know, there is no one simple answer. So it's a life's work, I think, to work in transportation. And it's a privilege, actually, to work in transportation. I think when it comes to challenges, you're absolutely spot on in your intro, which is an endless stream of policy papers and positions, because actually the richness of transportation and what it can do, should do, can't do, won't do, it occupies people. And you know, for me, I sort of think about, you know, the challenges that we look at the moment. You know, we face fiscal challenges, as we know, within the UK. So how do you make, you know, transportation as efficient as possible? We have capacity constraints. And therefore, you know, there's a whole thing about choice in transportation where, you know, one of the things that I may slip into is to err towards rail too much, as I have spent such a large part of my career in rail and rail infrastructure. However, you know, one of the big things about looking at capacity constraints is making sure we make the right choices early enough, that we use transport planning, strategic planning, so that rail is not always the answer. Sometimes it is bus, or it is highways, or it is active travel. And then lastly, you know, I wouldn't come on here and not talk to you about net zero, would I? And the importance of sustainable infrastructure. Well,
I mean, you have, I think, referred in the past to this tidal wave of medium-term issues holding back the transportation. Yeah, and you've mentioned them, some of them there: capacity constraints, the need for upgrade investment, and of course, as you just pointed out, carbon reduction. And much of what we've known about for quite some time. I mean, after all those policy papers and after all that discussion, is the landscape changing for the better?
I think that the landscape is set out. I think that where it changes for the better are in choices that can be made at both a national and at a local level. And within this, you know, how do we think about the importance of, you know, the levers that can be pulled? And some of this might seem a little bit dull to think about, you know, sort of like, oh my gosh, is she going to come on and start talking about policy levers for 34 minutes? And the danger is, do you know what? I genuinely could, because we've got the most incredible people in this country who care about transportation. You know, I look across not just our company, I look across the whole industry, whether I'm working with highways, local transport, working with railways. And the talent that we attract is magical. We have these really clever people who care passionately, and that is the landscape. But how do you give people, how do you navigate through that? And that is through those policy levers. That's through the choices that we can make about the railways, about rail reform. You can make good choices about investment. And, for me, I think that how we think about, sort of like the landscape is one not to be gloomy about, but one to help decision makers make the most of what's there.
Yeah, because I mean, you say that they are a slightly dull part of it, but these transport policy levers are key to making this transport infrastructure work, making it key to driving the economic growth, making us have better social and environmental outcomes. I mean, to what extent do you think the UK's current policies, its strategies, its planning regimes really reflect the huge role that transforming the nation's transportation infrastructure towards this lower carbon, higher growth economy? Do you think they really reflect that?
Honestly, not really, because we have so much drag in the system, and I think I would commend anybody who's listening to this to read the National Infrastructure Commission's report on planning reform. If we start at the very sort of like outset of how we get projects away, for instance. We've got such a drag in the planning system in terms of being able to do this. And when you've got drag, you've got cost, you've got inefficiency. And so you get this sort of like spiral of the intent is there, but how do you actually make changes to actually, give life to that intent through policy? I think, it's sort of like 10 years ago, it took too long for a planning application for an infrastructure scheme. It was about 2.5 years. And so lots of stuff was going to be done to improve it. So I think it's now 4.5 years is the average.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the first thing I would start with is actually stand back and, transport policy cannot stand alone. It is not an end in itself. For me, and, I've always, truly believed this, is that, transportation sings when it's embedded within a much wider concept of place and economic and social sort of strategies and policies, because then the true intent and the value of transportation delivers, sort of like delivering a road between two places that have no connection with each other will create a connection, but they won't actually stimulate value. For me, that sort of like when I think about transport policy, I'm always looking for and what is it hooked to? What is it joined to?
This is about breaking down those silos and making sure that we're actually thinking about these as a system rather than just an individual road or a bus service. But before we get into actually how to make that happen, let's talk a bit about you, Colette. And let's start off with what are your own public transport credentials? You're talking to me from central London, so presumably you at some point use some public transport. Are you a user? What's your preference? What's your daily intake of public transport?
So day in, day out, because I don't have a driving licence. So I use public transport every day. So, whether it's bus, train, tube, the boat. I'm a big fan of the boats in London. I live out in Kent, so this morning I had a lovely trip in. I came in on high-speed rail, so I was catching somebody for a quick coffee up at St Pancras, jump on the tube down to our offices at Victoria. But for me, sort of like it's part and parcel of my day, in terms of using public transport. And I'm speaking to you from our London office, but we have 44 offices across the UK. And so for me, sort of like when I want to go and see my team, sort of like I have, an awful lot of train travel under my belt. So I get to see the network in all of its glory. I get to see the network in all of its amazing frontline staff. And I also get to see the networks at the times when they're under stress, and you can see the problems that people are having to grapple with day in, day out when, we have the kind of issues that we've seen with assets over time. And, transportation is a belief, as in I get on the train and I believe I will be there on time, or I get on the motorway and I believe I will be there on time. And so people feel, disproportionately, I think, disappointed when that doesn't happen. And actually, how do you how do you balance the needs of passengers, but also how do you ensure that, frontline staff have a good working day? Because it's not always easy to be at the front line of an operational transport network, whether you're a bus driver or you are working on the rail, or indeed, you are providing highways locally and nationally.
But presumably, because you use the network in London and then go around the UK, there's a stark reality that things are very, very good in London. We are blessed, for us, those of us living in London, with a system which is very, very integrated. I mean, any feedback on what might make your journeys around the rest of the UK slightly better?
Well, you use the magical word there, Anthony, which is about integration. That is, for me, the thing which is the absolute joy of the London Transport Network, is how interconnected it is, and also how information flows. And, that for me is, when I look at the trailblazer deals that the current government has proposed, when I look at, the devolved policies that, sort of like the Labour Party has proposed as well, I am, most excited about how local and regional authorities are going to have the opportunity to really start to crack this nut about integrated transport and integrated transport information. Because the easier that you make it for people, then the more likely they are to travel. And that is my lived experience my whole life around, the reason why I travel so much is because it's easy to. And, for me, that starts with information, it starts with choice, and then, it also then underpins ticketing. So, the example that is always given is that other parts of the country, I hear sort of local leaders saying, they want a system like London. And I always just think they could perhaps even have a system better than London if they could crack that integration sort of piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, before getting into your thoughts about reforming transport policies, we should talk a bit about your career, as it perhaps sets a framework for where your thinking comes from. You joined Atkins Realis in 2022 after a career spent largely on the client side. The rail sector, it's a tough environment in general. And what attracted you to it?
So I started my career in banking, and I used to do sort of business improvement projects, IT-enabled projects. And I decided that I wanted a change, and that I actually wanted to join the civil service. And I had a look at sort of policy areas that I might be interested in. One of them was transportation, because public transport is a public good. It's something that I've always truly believed. And frankly, I started doing transportation and I didn't really want to go anywhere else. The scale and variety of the challenge, but also the opportunity that it gives you for a meaningful career. And, what greater purpose can you have other than wanting to better connect people, places and businesses? That is a fabulous thing. And so I started off in policy, but I spent quite a chunk of my career then in franchising on the government side, and then in infrastructure delivery. So I worked on the Olympics for 5.5 years. Yeah. And that was interesting because that was like the greatest act of transport planning ever, not just for 2 weeks of sport, but actually for the master plan that was the Olympic Park. And I genuinely am filled with joy when I see the infrastructure, the homes, the park, and the life that has grown up around there.
Well, most people that worked on that project describe it as their career high. I mean, is that the case for you then? Your career high working on the Olympics?
I think my career high, there's actually quite a few of them. And this is one of the things I would say is that, the Olympics was an incredible experience, an absolutely incredible experience. But also, it was also an incredible experience to work on franchising and work on the Thameslink programme, and also to work on high speed too. And, for me, what did the Olympics, what was so special about the Olympics and what do I take from it? Absolute singularity and alignment of purpose gets you about 85% of the way there. Because all of the capability in the world is, if you don't have singularity and alignment of purpose, you won't get there. But working on a project where every single day trade-offs were done quickly and transparently all the time, And that, that as a way of being, not just a way of operating, but a way of being as a team, is an incredible privilege to have worked in that environment. And I think that, one of the things that I always sort of counsel people about is, there's it should be like the Olympics. Well, the Olympics, you have to recreate a pretty unique thing in order to get that commonality and that alignment. And if you could crack that, then boy, would infrastructure sing.
Well, I mean, it's a project, as you say, it had much national focus. It had an immovable deadline. Contrast that with you spent 7 years working at HS2 as land and property director. I mean, how do you contrast the two? Presumably both of them taught you quite a lot about delivering projects and delivering investment for the UK. And, how do you kind of compare and contrast those two?
So an awful lot of similarities, actually. So as you said, sort of like for quite a chunk of my time, I was with High Speed 2. I was the land and property director and acquiring the land for phase 1. Now, actually, there's a commonality in alignment of purpose, because under legislation, you only had the powers for 5 years. So actually, time criticality of programme was something that, from that perspective, I was used to and actually you could work with. The Olympics was not universally loved. I was there in the very early days. I worked on the bid and I also worked on the master plan. And it was a very, very difficult scheme for people. We impacted people's lives, their homes, their businesses. And so again, working as the land and property director, it was that, but on a mega scale, because obviously the footprint of the Olympic Park much smaller. But those are the things that, sort of like, what did I take from it, which is how do you balance programme imperative with compassion when you're dealing with people? And that, to me, is such an important aspect of all mega infrastructure projects. How do we focus? How do we focus on the people that we impact? And how do we, ensure at the front end that they are not dismissed?
Yeah.
If we're not doing it for people, then who are we doing it for? And there's all manner of people in that constituency when it comes to infrastructure, whether it's, you start at the end users in a business case, you work back through the workforce who deliver it. You then come back to, well, what's on the ground now and how do we treat people as best we can?
Yeah. So, obviously, you do an awful lot of stuff on public transport. What do you do when you're not at work then?
Well, my husband and I, we are doing Around the World in 80 plays. We love sport. And so we always try to combine some travel with some sport. So this weekend I shall be on the buggy as he plays Le Golf National with some friends. I will be, I've obviously been to the Olympics a couple of times, but you name a sport, I've probably been to see it. Although I was out with our colleagues in India and they keep promising me IPL, but they've still not delivered me IPL. So I'm making a point of that on this podcast because I know they'll listen and that will galvanise them for my next trip.
Well, and are you going to be going to the Paris Olympics?
So I'm not going to the Paris Olympics this year because I made a different choice because I'm going to the Euros instead. I'm going to go and watch England and Germany. So I am making the choice of going to watch England in the Euros as hope springs eternal and all
exactly.
that.
Well, yes, hope springs eternal. Quite. Anyway, let's get back to transport. I mean, specifically rail. I mentioned that you worked at DfT. So any advice for those planning and driving rail reform right now?
So, yeah, the one thing I would sort of extol is keep at it, because the hiatus that we've had with rail reform, it just doesn't do anybody any favours, doesn't do the travelling public any favours, doesn't do the economy any favours, and actually we're so keen to see that, and I will declare my hand at this point, as well as being the Managing Director of Transportation here at Atkins Realis. I am also a board member of the Railway Industry Association. Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, everything we can do to support any prospective government in terms of rail reform is something that, both we will do as a company and I will do individually through that other role. I think that, one of the things that I think has been really great about the GBR transition team is their approach to setting up sounding boards, because, a lot of stuff people have got, not just views on, but workable solutions for. And I think that, when it comes to rail reform, that, one of the things that I was really heartened by in sort of like the announcement from Labour last week was their sort of proposal to actually have legislation in year one of a parliamentary term, because, we just need to move quickly.
Yeah.
It's not like, we've not thought about a lot of these things, but it's how we share that learning and how we share that experience in a way that is helpful and actionable and is not, something that just slows down the inevitable need that we have for greater integration.
Yeah. Well, of course, we have the rail reform, the long-awaited rail reform bill that's published earlier in the year, and it started that legislative process which should underpin the ideas of the Shapps-Williams plan for rail. I mean, I spoke to Milda at the Rail Industry Association a couple of weeks ago. I mean, her view as yours was that, it's just get on with it. So how can RAA, how can Atkins-Realis really help to move this legislation forward at pace?
So I think that, one of the things I would say that the Rail Industry Association has done is that, with the scrutiny committee, which is a really good thing to do because it starts the discourse, because this is just it. It's like get things out on the table. And the Rail Industry Association has put in evidence to that committee, and that is something that all of us in the industry need to be, is sharing that expertise and being vocal and getting practical solutions across. How do you actually get the governance framework right? How do you actually give people the sort of like the lanes to run in so that they can then just motor?
Yeah.
As I said, it's a conundrum. It's not an easy thing to do, but there are lots and lots of people who are so keen for this to work. I think that scrutiny committee on the draft legislation is a really great way to surface some things that, post an election, whoever is in power is going to have a richness to be able to look at and understand when it comes to then how you hone that into the legislation that's put in the House.
You say whoever will be in power, because of course there will be a general election in 2024, certainly by early 2025 at the very latest. And all parties are talking about transport, energy transition. They're talking about regulation reform and planning, of course. But are there any particular public transport infrastructure policy issues you see as dividing lines between the parties? I mean, the Labour Party's come out and talked about nationalising the rail service, probably a step beyond where the Conservatives are. But where are those dividing lines for you?
So I think there's an ownership issue where Labour want to bring back in-house. Then, where that goes, I think there's further sort of thought and conversation to be had on that. I think that what's going to happen with net zero, what's going to happen with how we decarbonise and at what pace. I'd just draw attention to a neat little piece of work that RIA have put out in the last couple of weeks, which is about a net zero railway by 2050, which gives some thoughts around, you don't have to always have big bang electrification. There are other choices you can make in order to get, like a step change in benefit. And I think that is something that, over the sort of coming months, it will be very interesting to see how the parties go towards a manifesto on that, because I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a massive dividing line, but I'm interested to see where it goes. I think the third thing I would probably say, Anthony, around that is actually, the pace of devolution and what that really looks like and what can and can't be enabled. And, we look at, what Andy Burnham has done in Manchester. We look at, what's happened in Liverpool. We look at the West Midlands. But then we also look at, the ambition in the East Midlands. We look at the ambition in the North East. Yeah. And so for me, I think, again, it's a really interesting sort of point in time where this policy of decentralisation is being embraced on all sides. And therefore, how far do people want to go? The proof of the pudding will be after the election.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Andy Burnham, the Manchester mayor, and most devolved administrations talk about it's fine, devolve the power, but also devolve the financing as well, the fiscal powers. I mean, is that the answer for you?
I don't think there's one answer. I truly think that, when we look at, where we are in the asset life cycle for a lot of our infrastructure, when we look at, sort of like the aspirations, when we look at, growth in this country and what it could be, then, devolution of central funding is one lever. But you've also got to look at things like farebox, and you've got to look at, sort of like how taxation and, fuel and the roads interact. And you need to genuinely think about, the role of private finance within all of this. And, you said what was one of my highlights. One of the most interesting jobs I ever worked on was when government sold the concession for High Speed 1. And it just opens up a totally different world, concessioning in terms of pension funds. And, there is nascent demand for investment in infrastructure out there. And how do you actually enable that whole mix to be unlocked in a coherent way? Because I think that a mixture of more funding locally, plus also some really clever thinking about fares and thinking about duty and thinking about tax and thinking about private finance, that is where I think, whether you are in Whitehall or Manchester, Liverpool, wherever, it's that mix that you really need to be thinking about.
And I suppose while the policy is really, really important and getting all that right here and right now, you are with Atkins Realis, which is a consultancy, and you are part of the team delivering and enacting those policies. And that all requires you to have a fantastic team around you. I spoke to Charlie Hodson at WSP last week on the podcast, one of the points that we talked about there was, the lack of diversity remains a huge problem across the sector. Getting the right talent into the sector remains a huge problem. How do you attract the brightest, the smartest young professionals to Atkins Realis? How do you compete with Charlie at WSP?
No competition there, is there, Anthony? Charlie's fantastic. I worked with Charlie over a number of years. He is super. And actually, one of the things that I think our sector does, and I'll start with our sector, is our sector provides an amazing grounding for early careers, whether that is graduates with degrees, but also apprenticeships as well. And if you start your career with an engineering consultancy such as ours, then you can go to cradle to grave, working across sectors, working across the globe, working on some of the biggest projects worldwide, but also working on really small projects that quickly make a difference. And that is something really valuable. When it comes to Atkins Realis, we have purpose. Our purpose is about engineering a better future for our planet and its people. And that really resonates. It resonates with me. It's partly why I came. I wanted to work in a purposeful organisation, and I wanted to work in a way where you could make a meaningful difference. But when it comes to attracting talent, we are a incredible magnet for talent. And, one of the things that I would sort of reflect on is that our early careers intake in 2023, so that mixture of apprentice and grad intake, we were 49% were from ethnic minority backgrounds. So we attract from a wide range. And then also, we also have a real agenda about our diversity, and we are the first engineering firm that's actually been given the Clear Assured Platinum standard. And that's because we actually embed EDI in everything that we do. We can do more. We can always do more and drive more. So, when I think about, things that I'm super proud that we've done, is that, how do you attract talent? Actually, how do you start to engage much earlier in education around, what great careers there are in STEM. So we have got an award-winning initiatives, which is Governors for Schools, and, a number of colleagues who've taken on being governors, and we now reach around about 72,000 children through our governors. The other thing as well that, I'm really proud of our sort of approach to sort of thinking about diversity is also not just in who we attract, but also then in the work that we do for our clients. And, we've done this amazing campaign for local authorities on getting home safely. And it's a toolkit that we've developed, and it's to help people think about how to design infrastructure that enables safer journeys home for women. And it's things like that make me, just so proud of the organisation, because it's about, putting into practice what is important for people so that those end users of transportation then can benefit from, that approach to EDI in everything that we do. And we talk about, different makes a difference. And, we see that because that sort of diversity of thinking then comes through in amazing things, then make a difference for, women who travel on transport late at night.
I think that really underlines the point that, what businesses like Atkins Realis are doing, it goes beyond the technical aspects of what creates transport systems and really gets involved in creating those investment cases that really articulate the economic or the wider economic and social benefits, bringing together all those different skills to really make public transport work for everybody. Sum it up for me then, Colette. How would you say that things need to be done differently then to help really drive the UK further, faster towards this lower carbon, better outcome public transport future?
So I think that I would say, if I had one answer, I would have strategies that look over a multiplicity of timeframes so that we actually start to plan over the longer term. But actually, when we look at it, strategies can sometimes just gather dust, but how do you bring them to life? So one of the things that I would certainly do as a practical instance, the National Infrastructure Commission, they're amazing. You have all of this expertise in those commissioners. In government departments, why wouldn't you just take one of your commissioners and ask them to be one of the NEDs, so that when you're doing decision making, you're always looking at the long-term strategy, that 15, 20, 25 year plus, and utilising the National Infrastructure Commission through a slightly different lens to sort of join the tactical and strategic back together in decision making.
Right, yeah.
And that's a slightly, Whitehall-centric sort of perspective. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't also have something similar for combined authorities as well. So I would heartily recommend that, transportation is great, but it's even better when it's situated in a broader socio-economic strategy and policy framework. And then how do you then bring to life strategy through near-term decision-making? And that's about having the right voices in the decision-making much earlier in the piece.
Colette, we could talk about this for a lot longer because it is a huge subject, but there's some really, really great suggestions in there, which I hope that, as we move towards the general election, there are many people looking for new ideas, so certainly your door is one that they should all be knocking on there. So thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast. Really, really challenging topic, but thanks for giving your insights into the things we can do about it. So thanks a lot.
Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Great, thanks Colette. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, but there will be more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline, and maybe I'll come back to Colette and get the rest of her thoughts on public transport in the near future. But right now, if you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information to all the things we talked about today, plus the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to Colette, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.